So let's, I'd like to actually offer a guided practice from my book. We Were Made for These Times, because it's on the topic of this evening's theme of how we can create more space, and take in more of the reality when things are difficult. So I'll offer you this guided meditation. It will probably be a little more than 10 minutes, but since we have 2 hours, I think we'll have plenty of time for everything else. So let's connect with our bodies and find a posture, a position that supports us to be present in our space. We can even look around a little bit at our space and just take in the colors, the shapes, the feeling of the space, and just ground ourselves in space. Push your feet into the floor if you're sitting on a chair, or if you're sitting on the floor, just really feeling your sits bones, your legs connecting with the floor, really making contact with the floor. And then letting yourself settle into this moment, into this body. So letting yourself really arrive here as much as you can. And this may take a while. We often have many parts of ourselves in other places doing other things. So just giving the many parts of yourselves time to all arrive here in your body, in your breathing. Collecting ourselves, gathering ourselves. Allowing the body to rest on the earth, and allowing the earth to hold us, as we also let our minds rest in our bodies. Feeling the in-breath and the out-breath. Letting the breath flow naturally in and out. Just let ourselves rest in the breathing for some moments quietly. So in this practice, we're going to give space for some difficulty, some challenge, some area of confusion or struggle or strain that we have in our life. We're going to let that be the focus, the content. So we don't want to pick something that's maybe super overwhelming, but maybe something around a 6, 7 at the most on a scale of 1 to 10. Or it could be less challenging. Some kind of place that's bumpy in our lives right now. It could also be something wonderful, but that's just challenging because it's a change, because it's new. So see what arises in your awareness as a question that you have, or some experience that feels unsettled, feels difficult or painful. And now visualize yourself in a large open field or clearing in a forest. And there's grass, there's trees in the distance, and a big sky above you. Allow yourself to open and settle in this spacious and calm place. As you sit in this field, bring to mind this situation that's causing you some distress. And feel your body as you contemplate the situation. Maybe it's some difficult decision you have to make, or a hard conversation you have to have with someone, or just some experience of awkwardness. Something that's breaking your heart in some way. And so now let this challenge or question come and be with you in the field. Maybe it takes some kind of form, like a shape, a color. Maybe it's a living being, or maybe it's a feeling or a sound or a scent. Whatever it is, let it be there right next to you, and try to get a felt sense for this form, this being. Now see a line on the ground that forms a circle around you both. The circle's diameter is just a few meters across, so you and your question or your difficulty are in a close space together. Notice how this feels in your body. Offer yourself these wishes. May I open to this moment just as it is. May my heart be at ease with the conditions of my life. Repeat each phrase a few times softly, these phrases of equanimity, inclusiveness. May I open to this moment just as it is. May my heart be at ease with the conditions of my life. And now see the circle growing bigger, maybe 10 meters in diameter. What is that like for you to experience more space around you and your difficulty? How do you feel? What happens in your body? Again, offering yourself the equanimity phrases. As much as I would like things to be different, things are the way they are in this moment. As much as I would like things to be different, things are the way they are in this moment. Is there anything that changes between you and this difficulty or challenging experience? Just notice. And now the circle grows larger to 20 or 30 meters in diameter. A lot of space around you and your difficulty. How do you respond? How do you feel? Continuing to practice with these reflections on equanimity. May I open to the flow of joys and sorrows with understanding and equanimity. May I open to the flow of joys and sorrows with understanding and equanimity. Now the circle grows as large as the whole field, and there is so much space. You can choose to go anywhere, have any relationship you wish to with your difficulty. Where do you wish to be in the field? And let yourself go there, wherever that is. And where is your question or difficulty in relation to you? And notice how your choice feels in your body. Breathe with this. Allow whatever is here to be as it is. If the phrases are helpful, you can continue to use them. Otherwise, you can let them go. May I open to this moment just as it is. May my heart be at ease with the conditions of my life. May I open to this moment just as it is. May my heart be at ease with the conditions of my life. Now let yourself sit in the middle of the field again, where you started. Your question or difficulty can be near or far away. Together you can enjoy watching the sun set over the treetops, and just let yourself take in the beauty of the setting sun. And see if in some way you can touch the goodness of your life, can touch some groundedness, some settledness, even with your difficulty or question still there, not yet resolved. Our practice, of course, is to maintain our strength, our clarity, our purpose in order to resolve or transform it. But we don't have to get lost in frustration, fear, or anxiety about our difficulty or our question. Reactivity to what is. Breathe in the beauty, the serenity of the moment. May I open to this moment just as it is. And now gently return to your body in the present moment. You can slowly bring movements to your hands and feet, and gently opening your eyes if you had them closed. And when I rise, let me rise like a bird, joyfully. And when I fall, let me fall like a leaf, gracefully, without regret. Thank you for your practice, dear ones. I know it's not so much in our tradition, the Plum Village tradition, to verbalize, to reflect right away after a meditation, but sometimes it can be supportive. So if you do have a word or phrase that you might want to share in the chat, just to offer to the group anything, whether you connected to the meditation, whether you didn't connect to the meditation, whether, whatever happened for you, right? If you wish to just to put in a few words in the chat, we can learn a lot from each other. So I invite you to share.
I bow. It was very nice for me, and I was. You were telling, think about 5 meters or think about 10 meters, and this was so eine Befreiung to see that my difficulties aren't on my heart, but they can make a lot of space. And when I make this space, when I see them away, it's not so heavy. I hope you understand what I'm.
Yes, very
Thank you very
well.
much.
Thank you, Letizia, for your sharing. Wonderful. And I'll read the shares in the chat too. Refreshing, it's very calming, soothing, close to the heart. Both my mind and body relaxed. I feel more calm as the situation is not so close to me as it was before. More space, more calm. The space made my problem seem smaller and not as pressing. The energy in my body and mind settled and I felt spacious. Thank you, dear Kaira Jewel and Sangha. Thank you, dear Vivian. I could feel space and ground. Mir ist ein Stein auf dem Herzen gelegen, der sich dann in liebende Energie aufgelöst hat. So I'll try to say that in English. It was like a stone was on the heart, and then in the loving energy, it loosened, it released. Very emotional. More things came up as I expected. I feel connected, easier. Sitting hand in hand with the difficulty. Yes, thank you, Sonia. I've heard other people also share that when they did this, somehow towards the end, they actually came closer to their difficulty, bringing it in closer to them. So yeah, thank you so much for reflecting in this way. This meditation actually came up for me when I was mentoring someone and they were having this difficulty, and just spontaneously we said, let's practice. And then I had them visualize this, and this person said at the end, instead of wanting to get away from their difficulty, they actually brought it in very close. And so then I thought, I'll share this in the book. So this is the practice I'd like to speak to today, about how we can get bigger, make more space when things are tough, when things are difficult. We can call it zooming out. We can use a microscope to look very small, but you can have the other kind of motion where you broaden the vision to take in more. And both things are very important in our practice. There are times when we need to go very in detail, to go close to an acute experience, to know it well. And there are times when that can feel a bit claustrophobic, and where that feeling can become so overwhelming, can feel like we can't deal with it. And then that's when it's very helpful to take in the bigger picture and see more of the situation. So there are, many ways that this kind of creating space, zooming out, widening can happen. Gratitude is one of those ways that we can shift the sense of space. So I had an experience recently where I had to give a talk on gratitude, and I was very grumpy and irritable right before I was supposed to share. And I thought, how can I share about this practice of gratitude? I feel so far away from the experience of gratitude. But being in that situation where I just had to share, it actually was healing and supportive for me and for my practice to bring in that awareness of the good. And so every time we practice, especially with others, all the things in us have a chance to, release. As Anna said, that stone on the heart could let go. And so I really felt the community, the fact that we were practicing together, that, and just having to, when you share the practice, you are also practicing, right? So the Dharma was happening, and then I could feel that gratitude start to really give me more space for what I was experiencing. This reminds me also of how our practice can transform actual physical space and make physical space seem different. I think many of you have been to the EIAB, IAP, Europäisches Institut für angewandten Buddhismus in Waldbröl. And you probably know the history, that it's a very, has a heavy history in the German history of the war, and was a place where people with mental handicaps lived. And then during the Second World War, it was taken over by the Nazi Party, and most of those people died, either from euthanasia or hunger, or from bombs that fell when they were displaced, because the Nazi Party wanted to transform that building where EIB is into a hotel for its workers. So we found out about this, and it was a very, kind of heavy karma that was still there in the space. And so we practiced there in that first year, all of our meditation and Sangha building, and building joy, and practicing with gratitude, and being aware of our steps, being aware of our breathing. And after 1 year, I remember people coming to EIAB and saying, "Did you repaint? Did you give a new paint job? Because it looks so much brighter." But we hadn't repainted, So that's the way our practice can change space. This practice of gratitude, this practice of mindfulness can make physical space seem very different. It was like lifting some of that karma. So one thing to share about this practice of zooming out is there is an interbeing of suffering and well-being. So many things are possible in any given moment, even if we think and feel only one thing is happening, like our suffering, right? Suffering is organic. It's capable of being transformed and composted right in the most intense moment of suffering. So we think that suffering cannot coexist with joy, with happiness, with peace, but they are very much interconnected, like two sides of the same coin. They inter-are. And so this is what Thich says. He says, we should not be afraid of suffering we should be afraid of only one thing, and that's not knowing how to deal with our suffering. Handling our suffering is an art. If we know how to suffer, we suffer much less, and we're no longer afraid of being overwhelmed by the suffering inside. The energy of mindfulness helps us recognize, acknowledge, and embrace the presence of suffering, which can already bring some calm and relief. So suffering can be there, and if mindfulness is there, relief can be there, right? And that can all be true. Suffering and relief can be there, right? So we can be in the field with our difficulty, and we can also enjoy the sunset, and our difficulty is still there, right? And this is the case in our world as well, this interweaving of suffering and transformation. So I was listening to a podcast about, this was the end of 2022, and it was a podcast on climate change and activism and spiritual practice. I think it's called Outrage and Optimism is the name of the podcast. And one of the hosts is Christiana Figueres, who is a Plum Village practitioner. She's also one of the main architects of the 2015 Paris climate talks. And so they were reflecting on 2022 and what were the main things that had happened. And they were talking about how much war, the war in Ukraine caused so much suffering in the world, not just to people in Ukraine, to people in Russia, but the shockwaves all around the world with inflation, the mounting food and energy insecurity. But they reflected that the flip side of this suffering is that many nations were waking up to the need to invest in renewable energy. They were aware of, how vulnerable we are when we don't have local, clean, reliable sources of energy that allow for financial independence from forces that are using fossil fuels as a weapon, right, to hold other economies hostage. And they cited this New York Times article that reported that renewable energies will overtake coal by 2025, which was a lot sooner than people had expected, because that was a cause of the war in Ukraine. So the suffering also coexists with awakening of some kind. Another aspect that can help us to take a bigger picture. So there's gratitude, there's knowing how to take care of our suffering, not being afraid of our suffering, seeing that suffering and well-being coexist. Another practice that can help us to not be overwhelmed is the practice of patience. And so I was driving on the highway some months ago, and I noticed a car in front of me that had a bumper sticker that said, "Student driver, please be patient." And I had been experiencing quite a bit of challenge in that moment. There had been some significant disappointments, some setbacks. And when I saw the bumper sticker, I actually cried because I touched how that's kind of an accurate description and request for all of us, right? Like, I'm a student driver on the highway of life. Please be patient. that we're each doing our best as students, on this highway, still works in progress, making mistakes, learning, growing from the mistakes. And it just struck a real chord of tenderness seeing this bumper sticker. My heart softened and I touched the power of cultivating this kind of patience with our own shortcomings and also with those of others. So patience is a power that also helps bring more space to a difficulty, because patience is about giving more time, right? It's about not saying, this has to happen right now. It's saying, okay, can I take a breath and give this more space, more time, right? It's one of the paramitas, these spiritual qualities that help us cross from the shore of suffering to the shore of freedom. Shanti in Sanskrit. It's also taught as forbearance, forgiveness. And of all the bodhisattva practices, patience is foremost. It's also one I think I struggle with the most. When things start to speed up and I get caught up in some sense of urgency, it's very hard to remember this practice, but it's so powerful that we can also be patient with our impatience. So when we notice we're not able to be patient, we can say, oh, it's okay. I allow myself that space. It takes time to transform. So we can notice and befriend our own impatience. We don't have to get rid of it. So really, what we're training in our practice, our spiritual practice, is to have some choice about where we put our attention. When we're caught up in something difficult, our attention gets stuck in that experience, and we're not free because we're caught. We are in reactivity. But when we cultivate mindfulness, right, that leads to concentration. And concentration is this ability to say, I can put my energy on whatever I decide to. The difficulty can be here, and yet I can also not deny the difficulty. It's not about suppressing, but it's about taking in more than just that. So it's about how we direct and use our attention. So this is this teaching of the Buddha on the 4 wise efforts, right? To nourish wholesome seeds when they're not manifesting, to let the wholesome things come up to our mind. And when they come up, we keep them there as long as we can. So we're directing our attention to allow the wholesome states to last longer, to savor them, to engage with them. The more mindful we are of wholesome states, the more they strengthen in the depths of our mind, the more likely they are to come again. So the more we entertain them right in our living room, the stronger they'll get in the basement, and the more likely they will come up again. So that's a practice of attention. That's a practice of concentration. And then the other 2 forms of wise effort, wise diligence, when unwholesome mental states arise, first of all, we don't allow unwholesome mental states to arise. We don't live in a way where these seeds are touched all the time. We try to avoid them being watered unnecessarily, but we know suffering exists in life. So when they are touched off, the fourth form of wise diligence is to help these states of suffering return to store consciousness sooner rather than later. Right? So that's again a practice of where we put our attention. So when we're overcome by something, do we allow it to take us over and run the show, or can we help it to return to a sleeping state? So this is, this being with the different states that arise, caring for them, noticing them, choosing, how we want them to manifest is very powerful in terms of not identifying only with the difficulty, but being able to see there are other things, like when a painful mind state, that feeling of overwhelm or anxiety is arising from store consciousness, we need to remember that all the wholesome seeds are still available to us even in that moment. Those seeds are still in our store consciousness, and they can still be invited to come up. Right? Mindfulness can be invited to come up. Compassion can be invited to come up. Wisdom can be invited alongside the difficult emotion. So that's where our concentration, where our attention can be harnessed. So there's a story my dad told me that I felt very moved by. We were in India with Thai. This was in 2008. And we had just finished leading a retreat for teachers in Dehradun in the northern part of India. We were going to get a train back to Delhi. And I was a nun at that time, traveling with the monastics with Thai. My dad, other lay people were traveling and joining the retreats and days of mindfulness with us. So we got to the train station, and there were people begging, and I wanted to take out some fruit from my bag to give to people, and my dad was helping me. He put some of his things down so he could help me give fruit to the people begging. And then when he got to his train seat, I was in a different car. When he got to his train seat, he realized he didn't bring his laptop bag with him. But when he took down his bag, somehow he left his bag with the laptop. So he got me, other monastics, we went out, we tried to find it, it wasn't there. And we made a report to the train staff, but we had to get on the train, we had to go. So of course he's sitting there in his train car by himself, full of anxiety and, just very disturbed. In that bag was his laptop, his phone, his keys to the house, everything. And so next, across the aisle to him, was a Muslim family, a mother and her two daughters, and there was a 6-year-old and 11-year-old girl. And the 11-year-old was closest to him across the aisle, and they started talking, and her name was Hannah. And so they introduced themselves, and he was just drinking cup after cup of chai that they were serving down the aisle to try to kind of drown his feeling so disturbed. And he asked, would you like some chai? And she said, no, I'm fasting for Ramadan. And so then he said to Hannah, have you ever lost anything, Hannah? And she said, oh, maybe a precious book. One time I did lose a friendship. We had a bad argument. We said bad things to each other. And so my dad said, well, Hannah, I lost a really big book, a MacBook with my keys, with my phone. And he told her how upset he was. She looked him right in the eyes and she said, Uncle, you need to thank God for the good he has given you this day. 11-year-old child. My dad was not expecting that teaching to come out of her mouth. And he really paused. So they struck up a friendship on that train ride. He talked to the mom, to the 6-year-old daughter, and they're still friends to this day. That family moved to Dallas, Texas. The father had a job and that they moved, and they kept in touch with my dad. He's visited them in Dallas. They visited him. Now she's graduated from college. She's an adult now. And they still call each other on Christmas. And by some grace, that bag was found and returned to my dad through our network of friends. But this story has always touched me and just helped me see, what's possible even when things feel really difficult. And, in this session that I mentioned, I had to teach on gratitude when I was feeling very grumpy. There was a question at the end of that session where someone said, but how do you practice gratitude when you're really struggling, when things are really challenging? And I talked about this awareness that multiple realities are true at any given moment. Things can be difficult, and it's also true that the earth is holding us. When we have air to breathe, the sun is still shining. Even when it's raining, the sun is still shining. Even when it's nighttime, the sun is still shining. So that's this capacity, right? To zoom out, to widen the lens. And we can take in these multiple realities. We can be with the difficult experience and also see the way life is supporting us, the way other beings are supporting us, and to be able to touch into gratitude as this 11-year-old Hannah so powerfully taught. So I listened to a talk recently. It was a Nigerian professor, Dr. Bayo Akomolafe, and he was being interviewed, and he was talking about this story from the book of Job, this book in the Old Testament, and how Job is this very upstanding spiritual man. He follows all the rules, does everything right. He was wealthy, he had children, he had cows, he had property, he was well respected. And suddenly in one day, everything gets taken away from him. His children die, no more cows, no more land, no more home, everything is destroyed. And he was in such distress. He was thinking, why is this happening to me when I did everything right? And his friends told him, you should curse God. But he wanted to ask God, why? He said, I want to know, why is this happening? And so he had the chance to ask God, why did all these things happen to me? And in this story, God says, you should pay attention to the amazing things I have created in this world. So the amazing way volcanoes erupt and the incredible structure of DNA? Have you given your awareness to that? That's what God's asking Job. Have you noticed the beauty of this cosmos that I've created? The exquisite radiance of a butterfly's wings. And Bayo Akomalafe says, it's kind of like a politician's answer, right? It's not directly in response to the question. But it's one of these answers that's an invitation, like a koan, right? A kum'an, to zoom out, to take in all that's happening in the world that is magnificent. That's also true, even as we zoom in where there's real suffering and there's real difficulty. So it's not denying the suffering and difficulty, but it's saying this exists and this also exists. So it's working against that tendency to say only the suffering exists, right? So I'll just share a few more stories of people I am inspired by who have been able to do this, taking in the bigger picture. This story involves mention of suicide, so I'll name that at the start. I read a very moving book over the Christmas holidays. It's called Don't Look Back, and it's a memoir of a young Sudanese woman. She escaped from South Sudan as a child during the civil war in Sudan. And it's a book about her life. She ended up coming to the United States as a teenager. And now she still lives here. But she tells a very harrowing account of escaping, just barely escaping death, from warring ethnic groups in South Sudan, and how her mother's friend, the woman who writes this book, her name is Acute, and it's Don't Look Back is the book. So she talks about walking on foot for thousands of miles with her mother's friend who's taking care of her. She's only 6. She walks across the whole of South Sudan to Kenya to go to a refugee camp there, where she ends up living for about 10 years. But she endures hunger, thirst, all sorts of diseases. There are wild animals that, they all have to protect themselves from as they walk through the forests. They walk through the desert of South Sudan, not sure if they're going to survive. Anyway, they make it to Kenya, and then she lives in this refugee camp. Very hard life, separated from her parents, separated from all of her family. She ends up reuniting with some of them in the refugee camp, but she ends up getting chosen to be one of the lost boys of Sudan. There were hundreds of girls in that group of lost boys that got brought to the United States, maybe other places as well, and given asylum. So when she's in the US, her life gets even harder, if you can imagine. She has all of her material needs taken care of, but she is facing some violence and abuse within the people that are supposed to take care of her, who came with her from Sudan. Not her family, but other people. And she, at age 16, she's so desperate, she wants to commit suicide. And so she has locked herself in the closet, ready to commit suicide. And she remembers her grandmother, who carried her on her back out of their village when it was getting attacked by a rebel army. She remembers the love of her mother's friend, who did everything to keep her alive through so many difficult conditions, walking for months and months to Kenya. And she reflects on how much people sacrificed to keep her alive when she was younger. And she decides she cannot undo what they did by taking her own life. And so she decides to live. She decides, I'll have to just hang on in this really difficult situation. And fortunately, that abusive situation ends soon after that. She's able to go to a truly safe place. But I was very moved by that moment where she's about to commit suicide, and she's able to zoom out and to take in the other people in her life who have loved her, who have cared for her, who deeply want her to live her life. And she's able to tap into them in her grandmother, her ancestors. And she decides, I want to honor you by taking care of this life. Last story I'll share with you is someone I know, a friend of mine who also had to flee his country for reasons of asylum. But he forged his passport. He had a fake passport in order to leave, and he was caught on his way to the US. He was caught, and he was put in jail in this country where he was traveling through on the way to the US. He and his friend were put in jail. And a young student of law, not yet a lawyer, was meeting with him and heard his story and took his case and was able to get asylum for him. So he was able to get out of jail after a year and was able to find an apartment. During this whole time, he had connected with a dear friend who he knew in his home country. She was in the US. They fell in love. And while I was there in this country with my friend, she came and they got married. And she went back to the US and they had a son. They got to be together for just a month or so, but soon after that, they had a son. He has not yet seen his son, and the son just turned 3 years old. He talks to him every day on WhatsApp, and his mother has had to raise her son on his own because the father, the paperwork hasn't come through yet for him to come to the US. I just learned this week that the wife got her green card, got her citizenship, not her green card. She got her citizenship. Now it should be quick, at least a little bit quicker, and they should be able to reunite and live together as a family. But what I am so inspired by in my friend, he's Catholic. He always has responded to the circumstances in his life with gratitude and with love and helping other people. So when he was released from prison with his friend, he started to help other refugees. And he started to translate things, books, spiritual books, into his native language. And he shared with me a book of poetry he wrote for his parents on their 50th wedding anniversary. So whatever he could do to help others, he wasn't allowed to work in this country that gave him asylum. But he did everything he could to help others. And every time we would spend time together, he was full of brightness and beauty and love of life, in spite of all of the things that had been taken away from him, that had been difficult for him, he didn't identify himself as that. He was able somehow to take in the bigger picture of his life, his relationship to God, his relationship to the church. He found people and he made friends. We are good friends. After 5 years, we still text in WhatsApp and we talk. So he's someone I find so inspiring, as someone who could, bear very big difficulties without bitterness, without seeing himself as a victim. So these are some of my thoughts for you, for us, on this topic of widening out to take in the bigger picture of life when things are difficult. And maybe we can pause here, take a few breaths together, listen to the sound of the bell, and then we can have some time for sharing conversation.